Justin, thank you for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
Well, home come to your alma mater. Uh,
That's right. That's right.
sort of, sort of. I was asking you the other day about whether or not uh, you had a moment like Mike Roston, where a boring econ class launched you in a different direction.
Yeah. I wish I had a good anecdote like
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
eh,
I didn't. My epiphany moment like that came earlier, actually, strangely enough, and it sort of wound up being a false epiphany, although it was true in the moment. Um, that was when I was an intern after my undergrad. I interned at the Nation,
ah,
which
a traumatic experience for many. Uh,
yeah, right, and a wonderful experience in many ways. Um, I learned an incredible amount there, um, but one thing I learned was if you do kind of like what's the term? Partisan is not quite right because it's not exactly partisan journalism. It's point of view journalism, um, where there's a sort of set worldview or a set of political commitments or ideological commitments that the publication or the outlet is sort of overtly committed to. Um, it can be really powerful because your audience is already invested, but it also limits
yeah.
the audience so much. So at that time, I I'd been in college. I didn't have a TV. The dorms didn't have TVs, and the apartment I had, I don't know, we had like rabbit ears, but there was no, we didn't get TV. And I was subletting an apartment in Brooklyn that had television, and I was coming home from working as an intern at the Nation, and I started watching Frontline, which I'd never watched before. I guess I knew it existed, but I'd never really watched it. And I remember watching it thinking, wow, you know, um, somebody with an elementary school education could watch this and really enjoy it and learn an incredible amount. Somebody with a PhD could watch this and really enjoy it and learn an incredible amount. And like a million people watched these things, right? Which is like seemed like huge numbers to me, right? And because when you're working at the Nation, it's like, who are you speaking to exactly?
100,000 people, maybe.
Right, maybe,
Yeah.
right, and so that was my kind of like epiphany moment when I was like, oh
Yeah.
wait, you know, there's something powerful about this form and this medium and sort of storytelling, and um, it just seemed so kind of um, so much more relevant, and not preaching to the choir. So I think that was kind of an early realization of that
Justin,
kind.
may
Yeah,
I interrupt you
sure,
and let's find out where the participants in the workshop and the students are. Can
great.
Stephen, do you know? Stephen,
They're here. They're listening.
they are. Well,
Yes, they're everyone. We're live. We
we
have
are live.
attendees.
Well, let me begin by welcoming attendees from SEPA to an open session of my TMaC class, which is called Narrative Journalism Across the Platforms and Across Borders. Those parens are there, but we're not allowed to have such long titles. But that's what it's about. And one of the things we do in the class is invite people in the media to talk about what they do and how they came to do it. Um, in this case, we have Justin Vogt, who is managing editor of Foreign Affairs magazine of the Council of Foreign Relations. And Justin is a SEPA graduate. Um, he is like many people you will meet around the media, people who've come through our halls in better times when we had halls that were more accessible than the current ones. Um, and people who successfully use the kind of for want of a word, diverse training that we offer at SEPA, who know languages, who have remarkable life experiences, who I would say the media likes to snap up as employees because we know stuff. And we've got a good record of gaining employment for them. And uh, Justin, let me ask you, you and I know Michael Roston, an editor at the New York Times, who's also a SEPA grad, and he claims that he went on the path to journalism after what he describes as a very boring econ class. And he started sitting in the back of the class, playing around with his computer. Blogging was a new thing. He started a blog, and that led to his journalism career. Did you have a moment like that?
Yeah, well, as I said, not in class, because of course, I was a really serious student. I was always paying very close attention to what all of my professors were saying. I would never have been sitting in the back.
Doodling on your new laptop.
Oh, no, never, never, never. No, but my as I was mentioning, my kind of epiphany like that came later. I had been working at The Nation, which is a small political magazine, a left-wing political magazine, and I sort of at the same time became aware of the documentary series Frontline, the PBS documentary series Frontline, and being an intern at a small and very successful and storied and in many ways terrific small policy magazine, and sort of wondering about the audience and trying to figure out about the impact, who was paying attention, who cared, were we persuading anyone, were we convincing anyone, or were we just kind of confirming people's priors, and then going sort of watching these films that were made for a general audience that didn't assume much about the viewer's education level or background or political beliefs, and had to tell a story and had to kind of keep someone's attention that way. That was kind of my version of Roston's anecdote, was sort of realizing, wow, maybe, I, as an obnoxious teenager, I kind of looked down at television and then had this sort of realization, wait a minute, storytelling, visual medium, this is powerful stuff. This can really be, and not only powerful, but it can be really good. It can be really, really good. So that was sort of my epiphany. Of course, in the end, I wound up, retreating into print journalism at a slightly larger place, but not much. And we still have this issue about who we're speaking to and what our impact is. So I maybe it wasn't exactly an epiphany. It was sort of a realization that I somehow misplaced along the way. I don't know.
Well, Foreign Affairs, the magazine you help edit, is a lot more open, glitzier, accessible than it used to be. It's if you go on the website, it's very visual. It's very interesting. It used to be, let's face it, dull. What's changed and why?
The magazine is different than it used to be. The kind of cheesy and cliche line we use, sort of half tongue in cheek, is that it's not your father's Foreign Affairs. But maybe there's a kind of weird like paternalism about that sort of reveals more than we intend. But I think what's changed is sort of precisely what I was describing in my last answer, was a realization that what the magazine does, we can do exactly the same thing that the magazine has always done, right? Which is, and sort of a concise explanation of that is that we publish articles on interesting and important topics by people who by dint of their scholarly, their research and their work as scholars, or their professional experience, really speak with authority on these issues, right? These are, for lack of a better term, experts. Of course, 5-10 years ago, you would never have had to say for lack of a better term, because the term expert wasn't as loaded and contentious as it is today, for some good reasons and for some bad reasons. But to do that, to pursue that mission, you can do that without compromising any of the authority or any of the expertise. If you focus on the presentation and you focus on accessibility, there's actually a huge audience for that, a huge audience for that. And so what you've described is kind of, it's a little flashier, it's more visual. We've taken what I would say are kind of baby steps in the direction of accessibility, especially on the website, which compared to other websites actually is pretty staid and sort of, dignified, if maybe the right word, but is definitely not dull. And the coverage itself, the other thing that's changed is not just the kind of aesthetics or the presentation, but the range of topics that we cover. We've really, the expression we use is that nothing human is alien to me, right? That everything should be the subject of authoritative and expert commentary of some kind. So I think that it's more of a sensibility that what's changed is the sensibility and the understanding of the potential audience.
So what do you look for, Justin, in a story?
Well, I love that you use the term story, because we're talking to narrative journalism class, that's as it should be. We talk about pieces and articles precisely because very few of the things that we publish are narrative or are overtly stories. I would argue that a good argument actually has elements of some of the same elements of a good story, although it doesn't have that kind of narrative drive or that character focus or the emotional kind of content of a really great story. So what we look for, very broadly speaking, again, it's interesting and important, right? Which sounds kind of like boilerplate, but if you think about it, it's kind of like, there are a lot of things that are interesting, but not really important. And there are a lot of things that are important, but not really interesting, so it has to be both. Or you have to find a way of making something that is obviously one of those things, also the other thing. And the source, the writer, him or herself, is extremely important to what we do, because our proposition essentially is that we don't do opinion, we do authoritative analysis. So the writer has to bring to the topic something beyond just a journalistic ability to capture important arguments and present them well. And it's a struggle for us because, the people here, the way I sometimes explain what we do is, let's say you read the New York Times and a typical New York Times piece of news analysis, where, you'll come to maybe the 8th or 9th paragraph of the piece and you'll get a quotation from some expert in the field on the topic. An easy way of understanding what foreign affairs does is we just go to that expert and say, okay, we saw you were quoted in this great piece by David Sanger or whatever. We'd like you to write, instead of having a 20-word quote, would you write a 2 or 3 or 4,000 word article on this topic that really goes in depth, that really gets the full, scope of what you were saying. We go straight to the horse's mouth. Now, the problem is that horses speak horse.
So that's the question I wanted to ask
you.
How much do you look for good writing?
Yeah, we love it when we get it. We love it when we get it.
Do you get it?
We do. We also get a lot of what counts as good writing within certain fields and kind of bubbles, right? That what qualifies as good writing, if you are an expert or a scholar, is something completely different than what qualifies as actual good writing. Because that a wide audience can appreciate and enjoy and understand. And that's because there's a whole set of totally perverse incentives that academics and policy people have to write in a way that is actively exclusionary, that signals their membership in a kind of guild. And there are interesting reasons why those incentives exist, and we can get into that if people are interested, but they do exist. People, even the wisest and best scholars, follow them for good reasons, respond to those incentives, and oftentimes are really resistant to our efforts to lead them away from that kind of rhetoric and towards a more plain English, direct, and clear form of expression that people can get. So, I mean, a shorter answer to your question is, we get a lot of really rich and detailed writing, and writing that comes sort of with a lot there, you know, a lot of really good content. It's in rough shape often though, and it's not kind of ready for prime time, an actual wide prime time audience. And that's part of our job, is to figure out how to do that, but without, you know, completely dumbing it down or being overly reductive, and also without angering the writer and seeming to just kind of put it through a meat grinder and it comes out the other side and it doesn't sound like them at all.
Do you have to heavily edit a lot of really famous people?
Yeah, we have to. It depends what you mean by heavy. I mean,
Yeah.
we edit a lot of well-known people more than they expected to be edited. That's definitely true. Sometimes they love it, and because they're like, wow, this is great, you know, this is really what I want to say, thank you. Sometimes they're a little ambivalent, you know, well, okay, you know, I see why you did this. I see why a uninitiated or a non-expert audience would like this better, why this works better. But, you know, I think we lost a little bit here and there. Can we put it back? Sometimes they just hate it, and it's a struggle, and the negotiations can be, you know, difficult. But I think our track record suggests, I mean, the fact that people keep coming back and that we keep finding new people to write for us suggests that we're doing something right. But yeah, it's you never really know. You never know when you're editing someone, and it's hard because, you know, look, I'm not an expert in anything really. I mean, I have a decent education. I went to SEPA and I went to Brown and I went, you know, I have these qualifications, but it's quite something to, when you're really heavily editing something, or you're really trying to translate something from jargon into plain English. There's a line that's sometimes hard to see where you really are, you risk totally sort of changing the point, or changing the frame so dramatically that it means something else. And sometimes you cross it without realizing it. Sometimes the writer thinks you've crossed it when, you know, you really haven't. But it's not necessarily, there's very little objective fact when it comes to that. It's all interpretive, and a lot of it a lot of the job of editing in a place like this involves a sort of having a self-awareness about your own limitations, the limits of your knowledge, and also an empathy, a sense of empathy for the author, who, you know, really knows a lot more about this than you do, but is sort of playing along and deferring, in a sense, to the editor's expertise, which is the subject of my expertise, is our audience, our readers.
So what's a typical day like for you, Justin?
Well, gosh, that answer to that question would have been so different 6 or 7 months ago, I think, for all of us, right?
Yeah. Well,
It really
give us
has
a day
changed.
at the office and a day at home. And a day at the home office.
Sure. Well, maybe the best thing to do would be tell you the most salient differences between those two things. And they have made a big difference. And I'm sure if you talk to people in a lot of different newsrooms and a lot of different places, they'll tell you this. The social element of making a magazine, of making a newspaper, of making a television program has been fundamentally altered. And as we sitting here, where, you know, this is very meta, where just like the social element of education and pedagogy and teaching and learning has changed, the kind of freewheeling. It's our office is a place of, it's very it's actually a wonderful place. I kind of miss it. I'm getting
It's a
getting a
beautiful
little bit clumsy.
building.
It's a beautiful building,
Yeah.
and the people who work at FA. I mean, I've worked at a bunch of different places, and this is a place that is distinguished by a generosity of spirit and a real kind of sense of intellectual inquiry. And people talk and have conversations and challenge each other very respectfully, very civilly. But there's a fairly broad range of points of view and backgrounds, people from all over the world, and so we're missing that now. We're missing that. We are in these little, bubbles like this, and there's very little replacing that. So, a typical the working from home and trying to, especially when you're trying to do something like, international and politics and economics, the sense of the narrowing of the world, and that the pandemic has involved, where you're barely getting outside of your neighborhood, much less, or your apartment, much less kind of getting out there and seeing what's really happening. I think it's an even bigger deal for for people who are doing daily news journalism. I mean, the inability to access a wide range of places and people is just, that's really tough. It's really, really difficult.
Yeah. So we have been living in a crisis period different from any I've seen in my lifetime. Even the tumultuous 60s were not as tumultuous as this in the same way.
Really? Do you really feel that way?
Oh, absolutely. How do you, as a monthly, keep up with it? How do you keep current? How do you find stories that are different?
We're going to have to come back to this comparison to the 60s, because that's fascinating. I
We'll have
love
to
hearing
do
about
that.
this, but we will.
We'll have to do that privately.
Yeah,
but
because that's really interesting. But okay, so yeah, luckily, well, we have two advantages. Actually, we only come out 6 times a year. So, that's not an advantage. It's a disadvantage in the sense of what you're talking about in terms of timeliness. But the website is daily. So, the website it used to be much harder because Foreign Affairs was very late to the web, right? The whole effort to translate what we do, right? Authority, expertise. This was not Michael Ross's story about blogging, and said, the web was a place that was in some sense sort of populist from the beginning. And in all the good ways and all the bad ways, and it continues to be. But so FA was very late to the web, because I think the sense was that the web just didn't. It was not hospitable to what we do. Of course, at a certain point, it became clear that wasn't true, and also that even if it were true, we just, if we wanted to survive, we had to get online and find those new audiences, especially overseas. So the website has saved us in the sense that we can stay topical. Although FA's website is not, we don't do news, we don't do breaking news on the website. We do basically just a faster version of what we do in the magazine online. But we tend to think we're rarely going to be your first read on any story. We're going to be your second or your third read, where it's like, now you want to know what really is important and what's really interesting. That's what you're going to read on foreignaffairs.com. The magazine, when things are moving this fast, it has been really, really hard to do the kind of planning ahead that we do, and without just falling onto kind of evergreen frames or just purely historical stuff. Right? I mean, turning to history is one technique that we use a lot, which is to say, well, who the hell knows what's going to happen, 2 months from now, 1 month from now, 1 week from now, tomorrow. One thing that we can do is turn to history and use historians, but also political scientists and other types of experts that use historical research and analogy to kind of explain, contextualize what's going on right now. How does it relate to the kinds of things that have happened in the past? How did those things play out? What's the proper way to understand the relationship between similar things that happened in the past and what happened today, right? An argument by analogy is not really an argument, but this thing is like that thing, and therefore it'll go that way. That's kind of lazy version of what I'm talking about, but finding really good historians who can go back and figure that out. So we've done that, but we've also tried to kind of figure out what are, regardless of what happens, even in this crazy era of tumult and change and fast pace, I think if you, a lot of that is I'm going to use a stupid fancy term that maybe is not even the right term. It's like epiphenomenal. It's sort of like, it's noise. And even though I'm not diminishing the extent to which things are changing quickly and a lot is happening, but whether a lot of what's happening or changing is meaningful or significant or enduringly meaningful is, I think, less clear. And so a lot of what we're doing all day is trying to figure out what's really important about what's changing or what's happening. Because if we can figure that out, the questions that it lights up, whatever we do, it'll still matter 2 months from now, and it'll still matter 5 years from now, right? Like we have this archive, we want the archive to matter too. So kind of the exercise of boiling down what's actually important or will it be enduringly interesting from what's just kind of important in this Twitter soaked, social media, cable news frenzy. I'm not, I sound like a snob when I say that. I'm not trying to diminish the importance of that. That is important on a minute-to-minute basis, but it's not necessarily enduringly important.
Listen, Justin, some of our students and some of our guests who are also students from CEPA have some questions for you.
Great.
And we should begin with a student in the class who's also a colleague of yours at the council, Elizabeth Powell. And she would like to know, let me read this, how are the various issues packaged together? She would like to know, how much do you rely on articles that are submitted to you or requested experts to make the argument to fit a theme? Can we actually go to Elizabeth and have her ask the question herself in her own voice? Stephen, is that possible?
Yes, I'll pull her up right now.
Pull up Elizabeth, please.
Terrific.
You see, you get to see her here and not in the office.
There you go.
Elizabeth?
She should be pulling up right now.
Yeah. Can we?
Didn't realize I was going to be promoted.
Yeah, well, why don't you read your question better than I could?
Sure. No, the question is just, I've had the opportunity to observe some marketing meetings, and it seems like there's clearly like a lot of thought behind every issue as it's presented. And I just didn't know kind of what comes first. People submitting, wanting to see their name in the imprint of Foreign Affairs, or y'all's vision for what you want the issue to look like?
Thanks, Liz. I think the latter of those two tends to be more important in the packages, right? So when Liz is mentioning the packages, each issue of the magazine has a sort of front section that we call a cover package, which has 3, 4, 5 articles on a particular theme. Since we kind of tend to dream those up ourselves and then go out and get we have a bunch of questions that we want answered, and we try to figure out who can answer those questions. And we go out and try to figure that out and get the best people to do that. So those are very much driven by what our kind of editorial vision or the editor's beliefs about what's interesting. The well, which is kind of the second part of the magazine, and the back of the book, which is the reviews and criticism. The well is a little bit more reactive to just submissions that we get, although we tend for the magazine to commission a lot. I mean, we get plenty of people want to write for FA, but we also, this goes back to the idea of like what's knowing what the audience is interested in. We often get pitches and submissions that are kind of like, oh, that's a great, interesting writer, we love that person, but maybe can we redirect their attention a little bit to this thing that we think is a little bit more appealing, a little bit more interesting, a broader audience, or a clearer way to frame the issue, and kind of point them in that direction. So there's sort of a combination of commissioning and unsolicited stuff. And then in the review section, it's very much about, okay, here's like a really interesting book, whose opinion or analysis of this would I really want to hear? If I'm reading this book and I just, oh God, I would really want to know what so-and-so thinks about this. Why don't we go ask them? And then they can write it.
Justin, let me ask, because a lot of questions are coming in and we'd like to get to all of them. Can we do this sort of like Jeopardy round?
Yeah,
quick question, quick answer.
sure.
Stephen Lasikis, can I ask, can we call up non-students to the screen, or do I need to read the questions?
I can pull up anybody who is in attendance to ask their own question.
Okay. Could you call up Stefan Monk, please? And we'll get to the people who are asking very practical questions towards the end, and because there's several people who want to ask you about how do I submit, and that's a good and important question. But I think it should be, as we say in structuring a story, it should be the kicker. So Stefan Monk, hi.
I'm pulling him up in a moment.
Yes. Or is this going to take too much time?
It should be happening now.
Hello, Stefan Monk.
Hey, yeah, sorry for the delay. So basically, I was just wondering, because a few of the CEPA professors are also senior fellows at the council. And so I was just wondering if the process to work with those senior fellows is pretty much the same as if it would be any external submission, or if there's some sort of closer process in that case.
In other words, do they have an in? Because you see them at lunch.
Not necessarily. Here's how I'll answer that. We certainly, because they're, colleagues in a sense. Yeah, we know their work, we know them. We have a sense of what they, are doing that would appeal to our audience. But I think that the distinction there is that the FA audience is a separate thing from the audience, for lack of a better term, of the fellows who are doing scholarship. It's not hugely different. They overlap a lot, but it's slightly different. So not everything that the fellows are working on is necessarily that a fellow is working on is necessarily, a great fit for foreign affairs. A lot of it is, though. It's not a house kind of pamphlet, really. I mean, it's obviously published by the Council of Foreign Relations, and it reflects the Council's mission and embodies it to a certain extent. But I mean, I guess it would be silly to say that, being a fellow at the Council has no bearing on your relationship to foreign affairs, but it's not kind of like, oh, well, anything you want to write, we'll publish it. It's the same standards are applied to them. They're more likely to meet those standards just by dint of being who they are.
Our next questioner, it has a name that I'm bound to mispronounce, and I hope he or she will forgive me. Shilpa Venegadla. Can we call them up, please? Stephen.
Coming right up.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your help with this.
Yeah, no worries. There's a slight delay between when I invite them to come and then when they show up on the screen. So
Shilpa, welcome.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed the discussion. I kind of want to get back to your point about accessibility. And I was wondering if you had any perspective as to how to take often very complex material, often very complex issues, and make them more accessible.
Sure. Well, I'll quickly do a quick answer. I'll say there are two ways of doing that. One of which you're learning with Claudia, and which is narrative, right? I mean, storytelling. I don't think there's a more powerful way of doing what you're describing than story. And I wish we did more of that. I wish we made use of that power more. Nothing can achieve that as well as having a kind of strong narrative that can show, not tell, right? I mean, literally that's a kind of technique, but it's also, it relates to what is happening. If you can show how complex systems or ideas, actually live in the world, in people's lives, you did it. If you can do that well, you've just, wow, that's great. If you're not going to do story, like what we do, it really has to just do with expression and clarity. A huge amount of what prevents access right? Prevents accessibility, is jargon or even purposeful obfuscation or purposeful. Lots of the time, what you find with it, you're working with very high level people. It's not as if they don't know necessarily, how to explain things clearly. It's just that, as I said before, they have developed habits of mind and habits of voice that sort of push them away from that. So, if you can take something and try to just explain it in a way that virtually anyone, you have to set your sort of standard somewhere. Say anyone with a high school education should be able to understand what you're saying, and the way to kind of measure that is understand it and be able to question it and challenge it intelligently, right? That's kind of the standard of what I see as real comprehension. If you've really understood something, you should be able to say, that's interesting, but what about this? Or about how do you know that? That's kind of the standard to apply, that somebody with a certain level of education, whatever you're aiming at, would be able to read this thing and be able to react to it in that way.
So does that answer your question?
Yes, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Yes, there are two members of the audience who have roughly the same question, which is how can they, as young people, as young practitioners in foreign affairs, be perceived as having enough authority to write for you? So Samir Kumai asked that question, so does Pedro von Montag.
Coming right up. Or do you want them up, or do you want them?
Well, we've got the question, and
okay.
Yeah, it's a good
beginning.
one.
Yeah,
it's a good one. And I'll give a sort of maybe uncharacteristically stern response. It's going to be tough for you to do that. I mean, I don't know the background of the people asking the question. Obviously, people at CIPA are not necessarily, right out of college. They may have, in fact, had professional experiences or done a amount of scholarship that would, in our eyes, sort of qualify them as authorities or experts. Which, by the way, I mean, I'm using that phrase and I'm talking about that as an extremely, as they say, problematic proposition. I'm aware of that, but it's one that we have to, we can be in the abstract about it, but every day I have to make decisions about whether, in fact, a person meets that criteria. We do publish people who are not necessarily august names or known quantities, and the best way to do that, there are two pieces of advice, the practical advice I can give you about that. The narrower and more specific the topic, the better the chances that your background will lend you authority on that topic, right? So if you're a master's candidate at CIPA, the chances that we're going to publish you on Wither the World Order, or is realism, is a realism in American foreign policy dead, or the really lofty stuff, that's probably not going to be the universe of topics that you're going to be able to add authoritative value to. You may have lots of interesting thoughts about that, but which somebody might publish, but FA, it's probably not going to do that. If there's a particular area or a particular conflict, let's say you know all about Nagorno-Karabakh, right? So, or the Armenia-Azerbaijan dispute, or if a great deal about South African politics, and have a kind of interesting argument about the ANC, in the current era, the Ramaphosa era. So those might be topics we're interested in, and again, where it's not that the bar is lower on expertise on those things. In order to be an expert or authority in anything, you have to know what you're talking about and be able to demonstrate that there's a reason you know that. But the barrier to entry, I'm sort of contradicting myself. The barrier to entry is lower, but not the bar. Does that make sense? So narrower, more specific, and and also be willing to write for the website and write shorter, and not think, well, I want to write a 5,000 word article on this. Be willing to write a 1,200, 1,300 word article for the web. And that's my advice, those two things.
Well, you raise a good point, and that's a good point for everyone out there, which is websites are often the way into prestige publications. And you get your foot in the door that way. And by the way, it's not an inferior way of working. You may have a much wider readership than you have.
That's right. That's right.
So as they say, I wouldn't say no. That is maybe a very good way to have editors notice you and show what you can do. And the other side that Justin mentions that's very important is, there's a song from the American musical Gypsy that a bunch of strippers sing called "You Gotta Have a Gimmick." It's a showstopper, but it's also true of journalism. If you have a gimmick, a specialty that no one else has, if you know something that few people have studied but is tremendously important, at a certain moment understanding aspects of the digital economy, for instance, that is a line into places that you haven't thought about. So it's always good to have a series of specialties. And that's one of the things CEPA gives people. I want to move on because we're running short of time, and sure. I don't want to lose some of these wonderful questions. Runway Wang wanted to know if you could talk about the application of technologies in journalism and mass media. Is computer science heavily relied on in today's media field? The answer is yes, but how much is it relied upon at Foreign Affairs? Because we're really talking about something very specific that is its own niche and that probably would exist no matter what else is going on in the media environment.
Yeah, I would say it has a big effect in two ways. One is just data journalism, right? Which is wonderful and in so many ways and has exploded because of the availability of these data tools. We don't do a whole lot of that. The other way in which it is really changed things, and maybe even more dramatically, is in metrics, right? Measuring your reach and your impact, which media organizations are obsessed with today in a way that they just never were before.
And some people think that's bad.
Well, I think it is good and bad, right? Like most change, it has good effects, but you can overdo it. You can become too attentive and responsive and not kind of have your own vision, but you can also become totally sort of obscure and remove your relevance. But it's a really, I would say that has, to people who do not work in journalism and media, is something that they are unaware of, just what a huge role that plays in terms of places looking at their metrics. How many hits did a story get? How much engagement was? What was the time on the page? What was the bounce rate? I guess the third thing I'll just quickly mention about this data question, because it's a really interesting one, is AI and algorithms and the way that social media, regardless of what the organization thinks its readers should read and what its readers spend their time on, there's this new middleman, right? The social media middleman, which uses algorithms to figure out, well, I don't really care what the editor thinks is important, and I don't really care what the reader says is important. I'm going to use this sophisticated behavioral modeling to give them what I think they actually want.
What makes that different than Madison Avenue?
I think the only difference is that the human element, traditionally the Madison Avenue model was, you had these kind of savants who were kind of, intuiting and almost in this priestly way, what people want and what they, now it's AI, it's algorithms who are doing that. And I think you can see what it rewards, right? It rewards hot emotion. It rewards kind of things that immediately inflame or confirm your biases, right? I mean, this has been demonstrated again and again, and it's not necessarily nefarious. It just is. It's a very blinkered view of human nature that these algorithms and bots and computers have sort of foisted on us, and it's dangerous, and it's dangerous to democracy.
The last 4 years, foreign affairs on the whole, and I mean the general genre, not the magazine, have kind of moved into the background of American priorities. If there is a change in Washington in January, how are you going to change?
That's a great question, Claudia. I think so. The Trump era, one of the interesting challenges for us was that, this populist strain in American politics, which has reemerged in the guise of Trump and the Trump movement, is, it's anti-establishment. And FA, amongst legacy media organizations, would, to most people who are aware of it, would sort of be like, oh, well, that's like, you don't get more establishment than FA. Right? I mean, the CFR, right? Yeah. And so right out of the gate, it was sort of, now we tend to look at ourselves in a more complicated way, but you have to kind of accept that the perception is to some extent the reality. For us, what that has actually meant is that, generally we think of in whatever's going on in Washington, because of the people who are writing for us, someone, not a huge number of people, but someone is listening, right? Like someone is reading, whether it's just congressional staffers or people in the NSC or people in the Foreign Service or even people in the White House. Like they're not necessarily going to do what, is the articles recommend in Foreign Affairs, but we're kind of on the radar. In this administration, it's not just Foreign Affairs, but it's not clear who, is being listened to, and certainly not something with the kind of reputation that FA has as being, it's kind of establishmentarian thing. So for us, there's been this kind of, one of the challenges has been like, we push authors to have prescriptions, right? We say like, look, you can't just make an argument that's analysis and say why all this stuff's wrong. You have to say, for a policymaker, what should policymakers do, right? What are the proper steps? What's the right way to approach this problem? And this is all, even in normal times or pre-Trump times, this is a hard thing to get. People kind of just tack stuff on it. And in the Trump era, it's been like, why even bother? No, there's no way in which the things that I'm suggesting are ever going to happen. Not just because of Trump, but because of just polarization and the kind of gridlock and lack of effectiveness in Washington. I think that places like FA, I'm speaking broadly here, if Biden wins, there's no going back. There's no going back. There's no restoration of the status quo ante for establishment institutions, for populist forces. There's been a fundamental pivot or turning point in American history and society, I think, in the past 4 years. Maybe 30 years from now, I'll look back and say, oh, that was, you were being over dramatic. It actually was no big deal. It was a blip. But I don't think so. And I think, in this argument I think Trump is a symptom that makes the disease worse. And I'm not talking about COVID, although that's kind of ironic, I think. But, the stuff that produced the Trump movement is deeper and bigger than Trump. He's inflamed a lot of it, but it's not going anywhere. And so for us, this question, this kind of fundamental challenge to our entire model of how we think about the world and how we communicate about the world as being kind of irrelevant and maybe even nefarious. We've taken that pretty seriously. And I think, what we want to avoid, and I'm keen to avoid, is is kind of at the end of this era, if it ends, by the way, saying, okay, well, back to normal, back to the way it used to be, because I think that would be an error. And I can't tell you exactly like, well, here's what's going to stay different. I don't really know. And that's kind of a fun and interesting thing to do, is figure out what's going to stay different and what's going to kind of revert. But I don't think any place all journalism and places like FA, places like the Times, the Post, something has changed and it will stay different. Lots of things are going to stay different, even
That's very interesting, Justin. We've got only a couple of more minutes, and I'd like to call on Danielle Nefton, Danielle, who is a member of our class, and she has a question for you. Can we call her up, Stephen?
Yep, doing right now.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to Stephen for doing such a good job at wrestling with technology for us. Danielle, please put on your screen.
Hi.
So we can see you.
There
you go.
So, sorry, what you just said was very rattling and very scary. So I'm thinking that through. But my question was mostly about your audience. I'm curious to know, who are your audience, and what do you guys do in terms of acquiring new audiences, whether domestically? I'm not sure even if you have an international audience, but I'm a little curious about that.
Yeah. Okay. So right out of the bat, I'll tell you, we have different audiences. Our print audience, right, our subscribers who get the print magazine, they also get the website, but the sense is that they mostly subscribe to get the physical thing, tend to be older, and I mean, over 60, over 55. They have high levels of academic, achievement. They're fairly well off, and they're primarily American. Our web audience is totally different. It is more than 50% overseas. It is mostly young people, from what we can tell. Our ability to kind of harvest the data, as we were talking about, is more limited when they're not actually subscribers. But it's a completely different audience online, and it's been really, for the past 10 years or so, trying to figure out what that audience wants, and frankly, is there a way to monetize that audience, right? Like, because we're published by a very generous and deep-pocketed institution that doesn't, and it's a wonderful liberty to not have to, the bottom line is important for us, but it's not the most important thing. But we have to be a going concern, and we bring in revenue for the council. Actually, we'd like to at least break even, as best you can measure that. So we think a lot about revenue. And it's hard to figure out, and a lot of places have struggled to figure out how do you, we have this huge, think about places like India, right? Like there's the old chestnut in American journalism. I was like, there's like hundreds of millions of English speakers there. Like, how do we get them to read our thing? And of course, what's really interesting is it's a characteristically hubristic American sense that, like, why do you think those readers in India care about your American magazine? Like, what the kind of assumption is, like, well, of course they would, because, like, we're foreign affairs, we're whatever, like, well, why wouldn't they? They're, we're first rate, and like, surely they see that. It's not necessarily true. They may respect it. They may kind of say, like, oh, well, yeah, that's great. I'm sure I've heard of that. And yeah, I mean, I read those things in college, and oh, there's some big names. But like, I only have so much time in my day, and I'm not an American. And like, your point of view is actually, like, it's interesting, but it's not vital to me. So there are limitations. I think a lot of media organizations, American media organizations, came up against when they kind of assumed, like, oh, of course the whole world wants to read American stuff. And it's like, no, not necessarily. You better give them a good reason, and oftentimes there kind of is no good reason except, like, well, because we're number one, right?
Unless you localized it and created a whole new website specifically for India, which is...
Well, yeah, and people have tried to do that, and then the problem then becomes, like, well, why are you the right person to do that? Like, if you're just going to outsource it to local editors and, like, then maybe you ought to just, if what you really want to do, why don't you just give them the money, and they can do it, and you can have some sort of partnership with them.
To be fair, or at least to show a different side of it, the New York Times has found that in many countries, its international editions on the web provide good information when there's a lot of censorship at home, or the media in the home country isn't, it's more under control of the government, or...
Of course. Yeah. And that's true. And that's actually becoming more true. I mean, that's one of our... Yeah. I mean, and yeah.
We only have a few minutes, and Pedro Francisco Mara Vomitag has provided us with what we in journalism call the kicker. And in case you're not familiar with this term, it's the way a lot of journalists close their story with a kind of ironic question or something slightly humorous. And Mr. Vomichuk wants to know mostly, besides foreign affairs, if you had a choice to choose one magazine to write in, what would that in this area, what would that be? And I have a feeling you're going to provide us with a kicker here.
No, he's asking me if I weren't going to publish in foreign affairs. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's an easy answer.
He wants to know who your competitor is.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a different. So, I mean, if I were going to publish somewhere outside of foreign affairs, I can give an easy answer for that, which is the New Yorker. I worked at the New Yorker when I was younger as a fact checker, and I have a great affinity for it and a sense of loyalty to it. I learned an incredible amount. The people there are amazing journalists and amazing people. And I have a huge amount of respect for what they do. And talk about a place that has navigated, the changes and the technological changes, the political and social changes in a really good and smart way. I mean, I don't think anyone's done a better job than them. So that's an easy answer. I mean, it's probably the one that a lot of people would give. I'm sorry, it's not.
Everybody wants to be in the New Yorker.
Sure. Yeah.
It's the Valhalla of journalism. So, well, I thank you, Justin Vogt, for coming to us via the internet from Brooklyn, from your office, which is no longer Pratt House, alas. But when this is all over, let's have lunch.
I love that. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing your experiences and your ideas.
Thank you all. Can I just say thank you to all your students, and I want to, before I go, I want to wish you all the best of luck. What you are going through right now as students is really difficult, and I know that looking forward, trying to plan for your futures, even under normal circumstances in the conditions you're in, it's really challenging, and my heart goes out to you. But also know that it's going to be all right eventually. I'm going to reassure you, I have no evidence for this whatsoever, but I'm telling you that you're going to make it, you're going to be all right. And you're going to have a hell of a story to tell about, your time in grad school and your early years of your career. But I think we all know, those of us who are a little ways down the road looking back, are thinking to ourselves, oh my God, can you imagine what it would have been like?
Yeah, there's nothing like good war stories.
Yeah.
So, or as the old saw goes, may you live in interesting times. Well, here we are.
Here we are.
So I thank you all for logging in and joining us. We have 2 more open sessions of my class that you'll be welcome to attend. Next session is on podcasting. And then for a final session, we have Jerry Mitchell, the great investigative reporter from Mississippi, who solved all the big civil rights murders and used the press to create justice. And he reminds us that we can all do that in some small way in our own work. So we hope you'll join us, and we thank you for joining us tonight. And I suppose a lot of people are going to log off and then log on to the vice presidential debate later on. Thank you, Justin Voigt. Thank you, students. Thank you, guests. And thank you, Steve, so much for making this technically possible. And also Aileen Ortman, who is a PA in our TMaC program. Thank you for your help. Good night.